Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
Right, let's get into it.
Imagine paying for a first-class train ticket, but because you don't really like the train conductor, the railway company decides to just cut off the air conditioning to your specific carriage.
That is a pretty vivid way to put it.
Well, that underlying fear of resource control is really brewing across Indian politics right now. Today, we are pulling from this massive stack of sources, editorials, science journals, political reports, to explore this recurring theme of power friction and structural bottlenecks.
Yeah, we're looking at everything from state governments battling the union over tax money to the United States bypassing global trade rules, all the way down to how, solar panels might actually save a farmer's crop.
Exactly. And we are jumping right into our first editorial, which looks at the concept of the double-engine Sarkar.
Right, the double engine.
Yeah, we hear this catchy slogan every single election season, right?
Yeah.
It promises that if voters put the same political party in power at both the state and union levels, development will just, accelerate.
Yeah, but there is a fundamental constitutional dilemma hiding right behind that promise.
What kind of dilemma?
Well, the premise kind of assumes that cooperative federalism is a reward for political alignment, rather than a constitutional guarantee.
I see.
Because the Indian Constitution deliberately designed a federal partnership where the taxes collected from citizens, they belong to the republic as a whole, not to a specific ruling party.
Right, so a citizen living in Kerala pays the same central taxes as a citizen in Madhya Pradesh.
Exactly. And the structural promise is that both states get a fair, calculated share back to fund their own development. And that's supposed to be completely independent of which party sits in New Delhi or the state capital.
So, returning to that train analogy, having two engines pulling in the exact same direction sounds incredibly efficient on paper.
It does, yeah.
But the anxiety from state governments is about what happens if the central engine intentionally starves the rear engine of coal, just because that rear engine is painted a different political color.
Right, and that anxiety is manifesting as genuine structural grievances right now, particularly among southern states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka.
Because they feel like they're losing out?
Yeah, they are looking at the mathematics of resource distribution and feeling practically penalized for their own governance successes, like stabilizing their population growth, for instance.
Wait, but isn't there a system for this?
There is. The Finance Commission, under Article 280, is supposed to ensure that fiscal transfers remain strictly rule-based.
So where's the mechanism breaking down then?
It's breaking down because of the union government's increasing reliance on cesses and surcharges.
Okay, unpack that for us. What's the difference?
Well, unlike standard income or corporate taxes, revenue collected through assess falls entirely outside the divisible pool.
Oh, wow. So they don't have to share it at all.
Exactly. It goes straight into the union's coffers and doesn't have to be shared with the states.
And we are seeing this friction bleed directly into the legislative process, too. The editorials highlight this ongoing debate regarding governors in opposition-ruled states, essentially pocket vetoing legislation.
Yeah, that's a huge point of contention.
How does a governor, simply delaying a signature, technically stall an entire elected legislature?
Well, it creates this constitutional limbo. A state assembly passes a bill, but it only becomes law when the governor gives assent.
Right.
So by simply sitting on the bill for months or even years without sending it back for reconsideration, the governor bypasses the legislature's will without ever formally rejecting it.
That sounds like a massive loophole.
It was, until the Supreme Court recently stepped into this. In the 2023 State of Punjab versus Principal Secretary case, they ruled that governors cannot use inaction as a veto tool.
So they essentially said you have to make a decision.
Yes. The court signaled that the legislative sovereignty of elected state assemblies absolutely must be protected from administrative stalling.
But pushing back on this from a purely pragmatic standpoint, isn't coordination just naturally faster, with less bureaucratic friction, when both levels of government share the exact same policy ideology?
I mean, sure, administrative speed often does improve with ideological alignment, but a constitutional democracy prioritizes fairness and checks and balances over sheer speed.
That makes sense.
The framers set up these institutions to ensure equitable development regardless of who holds power. When a state's governance becomes hostage to whether it aligns politically with the center, the outer shell of federalism remains, but the internal mechanics are quietly dismantled.
Wow. Let's take that idea of raw power overriding agreed-upon rules and apply it to the global stage.
Okay, shifting gears.
Yeah, our second editorial shifts focus to international trade friction, specifically looking at the United States.
Right, the new tariffs.
Exactly. The U.S. recently invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 to slap a 10% temporary import surcharge on certain goods, claiming a balance of payment crisis.
Yes, a balance of payment crisis.
Wait, the U.S. economy is massive and controls the global reserve currency. How can they legitimately claim a balance of payment crisis? Is that a real economic designation here or just a legal loophole?
It is widely viewed as a very stretched legal loophole.
I figure.
Because a balance of payment crisis typically means a country doesn't have enough foreign currency reserves to pay for its essential imports. It's something countries like Sri Lanka or Pakistan have faced recently.
Right, not exactly the U.S.
Exactly. The U.S. is essentially using a massive trade deficit as justification. Currently, 24 U.S. states are actually challenging this surcharge in domestic courts.
Wait, 24 of their own states are suing.
Yeah. Furthermore, under World Trade Organization rules, if a country truly faces a severe balance of payment crisis, they are allowed to impose import restrictions or quotas, but not blanket tariffs.
And the U.S. isn't stopping with just import surcharges. They've initiated Section 301 proceedings against India, the European Union, China, and others.
Yeah, targeting what they call excess manufacturing capacity and forced labor.
This looks exactly like big stick diplomacy. Merely holding a massive stick, the threat of devastating tariffs, gives you immense leverage to force other nations to negotiate on your terms.
That's spot on. Actually, a WTO disputes panel ruled on Section 301 back in the late 1990s.
What did they say?
They pointed out the core anomaly. It gives the U.S. the unilateral right to act as judge, jury, and executioner regarding what violates international trade rules.
The profound irony here is that the U.S. was the chief architect of the WTO's rule-based order.
Oh, absolutely. Yet, over the last several years, the U.S. has systematically blocked the appointment of new judges to the WTO's appellate body.
So they just starved the Court of Judges.
Yes. By doing that, they effectively paralyzed the very dispute settlement mechanism they helped create, ensuring no one can hold them accountable for unilateral tariffs.
If the WTO's enforcement mechanism has become completely toothless, doesn't a country have a sovereign right or even a fiduciary obligation to its citizens to act unilaterally to protect its own domestic economy?
Protecting domestic industries is a valid sovereign priority, sure. But when the world's largest economy entirely bypasses multilaterally agreed rules, it injects massive systemic fragility into the global market.
The ripple effects must be huge.
They are immediate. For nations like India, the strategic takeaway is that relying on the WTO rulebook is no longer enough. There is an urgent need to build new, robust trade coalitions to counterbalance that raw, unilateral power advantage.
Let's pivot from the export of manufactured goods and tariffs to the export of traditional culture and health services.
Moving into today's opinion section.
Yeah, India is making a massive structured push to take Ayurveda global. The government recently bumped the AWUSH ministry's budget to 4,408 crore rupees.
That is a significant jump.
And they are setting up 3 new All-India Institutes of Ayurveda modeled directly after the premier AIIMS hospitals.
Right. The scale of this investment really marks a structural repositioning. The strategy is to move Ayurveda from a domestic alternative medicine to a globally recognized health system.
What's the catalyst for this push right now?
A major one is the newly negotiated India-EU Free Trade Agreement. That agreement aims to allow Indian Ayurvedic practitioners to operate legally within Europe.
Oh, interesting.
And it's pushing for a framework where Indian safety and quality certifications are accepted by European regulators without requiring redundant local testing.
Here's where the philosophical friction gets really interesting. Modern biomedicine heavily relies on anatomical localization.
Right, zooming in on the specifics.
Yeah, it acts like a mechanic identifying and fixing one specific broken part in a car engine. Ayurveda, on the other hand, views the human body as an ecological, interdependent system.
That's much broader.
Exactly. It's more like a gardener tending to the soil, the climate, and the overall ecosystem of a plant.
To push that gardener analogy further, the friction arises when that gardener has to prove their methods to a Western regulatory board.
Because they don't speak the same language.
Exactly. A standard clinical trial demands you isolate the exact drop of chemical or single grain of fertilizer that makes the plant grow. You have to prove cause and effect for one isolated variable.
But Ayurveda doesn't work like that.
No, Ayurveda argues the plant heals because of the holistic interaction of the diet, the herbal compound, the season, and the patient's specific constitution.
So you cannot easily isolate one variable without destroying the context of the treatment.
Precisely. The core tension is that if AUSH products want to circulate freely in the EU, they must submit to rigorous, independent, third-party scientific evaluation designed for that mechanic model.
Isn't demanding that a holistic, centuries-old system forcibly contort itself into the rigid, isolated framework of a Western clinical trial just a modern form of colonial bias?
The history of colonial medicine intentionally marginalizing indigenous healing systems makes that a very common and understandable defense.
Right.
However, in the realm of global public health, demanding empirical evidence is not cultural betrayal, it is a universal safety standard.
Okay, fair point.
Currently, many Ayurvedic safety assessments are funded directly by the ministry promoting them, which presents a structural conflict of interest to foreign regulators. Validating these treatments through transparent, independently funded trials doesn't diminish the tradition. It translates its efficacy into a language the entire global medical community can trust.
Well, we're transitioning from exporting our ancient knowledge to looking at a terrifying vulnerability in how we import modern essentials.
Yes, another opinion piece highlights this today.
It points out the deep geopolitical risks surrounding liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and agricultural fertilizers. The ongoing conflicts in West Asia are severely disrupting global shipping routes.
And the sheer volume of imports makes India highly exposed here. In 2025 alone, India purchased over 261 lakh metric tons of natural gas on the international market.
Wow, 261 lakh metric tons.
And crucially, more than 40% of that supply is locked into long-term contracts with Qatar.
So the vulnerability is pure geography then.
Exactly. Every single shipment from Qatar must pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that has become a dangerous geopolitical choke point due to the regional conflicts.
This triggers an alarming domino effect. A geopolitical clash thousands of miles away directly threatens the fertilizer on an Indian farmer's field and ultimately the cost of the food on your plate.
Let's break down the mechanism there for the listeners.
Yeah, so 30% of India's imported LNG is dedicated to producing ammonia, which is the foundational chemical building block required to manufacture urea fertilizer.
Right. You literally cannot synthesize modern urea without the hydrogen provided by natural gas.
So what's happening to the plants right now?
Because of the supply chain curtailments at the Strait of Hormuz, Indian urea manufacturing plants are currently running at only half of their capacity.
Half capacity, that's terrifying.
And the vulnerability is twofold. We don't just import the raw gas to make fertilizer, we also import the finished fertilizer directly.
Wait, we import the gas A&D, the finished fertilizer?
Yes. Out of the 2,300 lakh metric tons of urea India imported last year, a staggering 71% originated from West Asia.
Okay, but India already produces over 300 lakh metric tons of urea domestically. Instead of panicking over choke points in the Strait of Hormuz, why don't we just aggressively ramp up our own domestic fertilizer factories and become entirely self-sufficient?
The bottleneck is the energy source itself. Domestic urea production has indeed grown, but the chemical process remains incredibly energy intensive.
I see.
If the natural gas supply from the Gulf is choked off, our domestic factories physically lack the raw materials to operate. India simply does not possess enough domestic natural gas reserves to independently feed the massive, continuous demand of its agricultural sector.
Which leads us perfectly into today's science section, looking at a homegrown, futuristic solution to these exact energy and land constraints.
Right, AgriPV.
Yeah, agri-photovoltaics. The government is backing this through the PM Co-Usum scheme, which just received a 5,000 crore rupee outlay.
AgriPV represents a really brilliant technological integration. Traditionally, you either use a plot of land for farming or you pave it over with a massive solar park.
It's usually one or the other.
But AgriPV allows you to generate commercial solar power and cultivate crops on the exact same piece of earth simultaneously.
It's essentially building bunk beds for farmland.
I love that analogy.
You maximize the vertical space, so the solar panels get the top bunk to cast the direct radiation, and the crops get the bottom bunk.
Yeah, the engineering relies on elevating the panels on tall structures or arranging them in widely spaced rows or even vertical panels.
Do the panels block too much light, though?
Well, what researchers are finding is that the panels actually create a highly beneficial microclimate for the bottom bunk. The shade from the panels drastically reduces water evaporation from the soil, which is critical in arid regions.
It's a huge co-benefit.
And they act as a physical shield, protecting delicate crops from extreme heat waves or sudden hailstorms. Plus, the farmer gains a lucrative second income stream by selling the generated electricity back to the grid.
But wait, plants biologically require direct sunlight to perform photosynthesis and survive? Aren't we severely risking our foundational crop yields by sticking giant metal umbrellas over the fields?
That is the primary biological constraint, for sure. You cannot plant a highly sun-dependent crop like wheat or corn under these arrays.
So what can you plant?
The system requires specifically selected shade-tolerant crops. Field trials in Madhya Pradesh have shown excellent yields for tomatoes and turmeric under the panels, while experiments in Karnataka have successfully grown ragi and grapes.
Okay, so the biology works if you pick the right crops.
Right. But the most significant barrier preventing mass adoption isn't biological, it's financial.
Because of the steel.
Yes, building the heavy steel elevated structures to hold panels high enough for tractors to pass underneath requires massive upfront capital.
And most farmers don't have that kind of cash.
Exactly why agricultural economists are lobbying for a dedicated 10-gigawatt component in the upcoming PM Kiyosim 2.0 scheme, specifically providing viability gap funding to subsidize those heavy initial construction costs for farmers.
Let's put the agricultural and energy bottlenecks on pause for a second and flip to the text and context section.
We're looking at everyday family finances now.
Yeah, how everyday families manage financial bottlenecks. There is a massive public misconception regarding India's true insurance gap, driven entirely by how we measure the data.
This is a really crucial point. The industry relies heavily on two metrics: insurance penetration, which calculates total premiums collected as a percentage of the national GDP.
And the second one.
Insurance density, which measures the average premium paid per person. Based on the sheer volume of money flowing into these premiums, reports often suggest India is closing its insurance gap.
But evaluating protection based on premium revenue is deeply misleading.
Very much so.
It's like buying a diamond-encrusted umbrella. You spend an absolute fortune on it, which makes your household's umbrella spending metric look incredibly high.
Right.
But because the umbrella is so tiny, it legally locks up your money while only covering your nose in a rainstorm.
That's the perfect way to visualize it. The financial trap is that the vast majority of those high premiums in India are being funneled into endowment plans or unit-linked insurance policies.
Not actual life insurance.
Well, they are hybrid products marketed heavily as savings or investment tools rather than pure term life protection. The tragic reality of the strategy is exposed in the claims data.
What does the data show?
When you look at the last batch of over 10 lakh death claims settled by life insurers, the average payout to the grieving family was a mere 3.3 lakh rupees.
3.3 lakh is mathematically insufficient to replace a primary breadwinner's income or pay off a standard home loan.
It might cover household expenses for 3 to 6 months at best. The data proves that the core crisis is not access or awareness. Millions of Indian households actively pay for policies.
So what is the crisis?
It's the severe inadequacy of the actual cover. Families believe they are protected because they pay a high premium, not realizing the death benefit is dangerously low.
But pushing back on the financial logic, even if these policies act more like forced savings accounts, isn't high insurance penetration still a net positive for society? Because it ensures households are actively building a financial reserve.
Forced savings discipline is beneficial, yeah. But conflating a low-yield savings product with a catastrophic safety net is a dangerous public policy failure.
It creates a false sense of security.
Exactly. When the government and industry treat revenue-based premiums as proof of social security, it masks the grim reality that millions of households remain one sudden tragedy away from total financial ruin. Clear policy requires measuring the actual replacement value of the coverage, not just the revenue collected.
Sticking with the text and context section, let's shift from the personal duty of protecting your family's finances to the civic duty of participating in a democracy.
Right, with several crucial assembly elections approaching.
Yeah, the Election Commission has laid out the schedule, and the Supreme Court recently entertained a petition questioning why voting isn't mandatory.
Compulsory voting is a debate that surfaces almost every single major election cycle.
What does the law actually say right now?
Under the current legal framework, specifically Article 326 of the Constitution and the Representation of the People Act voting in India, is strictly categorized as a statutory right. It is not codified as a fundamental or legally enforceable duty.
But other major democracies do enforce it.
They do, yes.
Countries like Australia, Argentina, and Brazil will physically fine you for not showing up to the polls. Peru takes it a step further and denies certain public services to non-voters.
It's the classic stick approach.
Right, whereas India has always relied on the carrot massive awareness campaigns, declaring Election Day a statutory holiday, appealing to civic pride.
And historically, every major legal review in India has sided with that carrot approach. Both the 1990 Dinesh Goswami Committee on Electoral Reforms and a comprehensive 2015 Law Commission report explicitly advised against compulsory voting.
Why are they so against it if it works elsewhere?
While threatening fines mathematically increases voter turnout, attempting to penalize and prosecute millions of non-voters in a country with India's vast geography, immense poverty, and massive migrant labor force is viewed as disproportionately harsh and administratively impossible.
We legally compel citizens to pay their taxes, obey traffic laws, and follow regulations precisely for the survival and funding of the state. Since a representative democracy literally cannot survive or function without voters, why shouldn't casting a ballot be an enforced civic obligation, just like paying taxes?
It's a fair question. The constitutional counterargument hinges on Article 19, Section 1, which guarantees the fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression.
Okay, so how does that apply to voting?
In a democratic framework, the freedom to express your political will inherently includes the freedom to remain completely silent. Forcing a citizen to participate in a system they may feel deeply alienated by violates that core freedom.
So you have the right to abstain.
Exactly. The Law Commission argued that instead of punishing citizens for abstaining, the state's responsibility is to remove the physical bottlenecks preventing them from voting in the first place.
Like what?
Like providing subsidized transport for migrant laborers or engineering secure remote voting technologies. Make it easier, don't just punish them for not doing it.
We're going to connect that slow, deliberate nature of democratic decision-making to a very specific, agonizing historical example in our final text and context piece.
This is a wild story.
It is the story of India's 70-year journey to adopt coal gasification technology. It reads like the ultimate I told you so moment in the history of Indian science.
The timeline is honestly a masterclass in bureaucratic short-sightedness.
Take us back to the beginning.
In 1955, a visionary scientist named Syed Hussein Zahir formally proposed building a national gas grid fueled entirely by gasified coal.
And the Prime Minister liked it, right?
Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was actually quite supportive of the concept. However, the administrative bureaucracy completely stonewalled the project.
Typical red tape.
Yeah, they argued that transporting the gas was too complex, and they pivoted the national focus entirely toward imported petroleum instead.
So the scientific foresight was completely buried under administrative red tape.
It was completely buried until the global oil shock of 1973 hit.
Oh, right.
Which quadrupled petroleum prices overnight and triggered massive panic. Suddenly, the government realized their error.
And what happened to the equipment?
Specialized gasification machinery that had been literally sitting unpacked in wooden crates for 7 years was frantically assembled.
Unpacked in crates for 7 years. That is unbelievable. Yeah. By 1977, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi publicly admitted the strategic mistake of ignoring Zahir's initial proposal. Decades later, the technology eventually matured into what is now known as Integrated Gasification Combined Cycle, spearheaded by BHEL.
And now, it is a massive cornerstone of national policy. The 2021 National Coal Gasification Mission aims to gasify 100 million tons of coal by the year 2030, backed by a staggering 85,000 crore rupees in targeted investments.
That's a huge pivot.
But wait, let's look at the science of gasification here. We're in the middle of a global climate crisis. Turning solid coal into synthetic gas might strip out some sulfur, making it cleaner than just throwing raw coal into a furnace, but it's still fundamentally a fossil fuel.
That's undeniably true.
Isn't pouring 85,000 crore rupees into coal a massive step backward for our net zero emissions targets?
That is the central friction of India's energy transition. The chemical process of gasification subjecting coal to high heat and pressure to create synthetic gas does significantly reduce localized air pollution. And it makes the ammonia we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It produces critical chemical byproducts like ammonia. But you are entirely correct. The carbon footprint remains massive.
So why are we doing it?
The government's core argument is economic pragmatism. For a rapidly developing economy, managing 1 billion people, executing a sudden, complete transition away from our most abundant, cheapest domestic resource, which is coal, would trigger an economic collapse.
So it's a stopgap.
Yeah, gasification is heavily funded because it is viewed as the only viable bridge technology to ensure absolute energy security while the country slowly builds out its renewable infrastructure.
That theme of energy independence seamlessly transitions us into today's business section, where we zoom out to the global macroeconomic stage.
Looking at the whole picture.
We're currently watching how a lack of energy resilience triggers a massive, delayed global food crisis.
The warnings currently being issued by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development are incredibly stark.
This ties back to the Strait of Hormuz, right?
Yes. The geopolitical conflict involving Iran, which we noted was disrupting India's LNG imports, is simultaneously devastating the global fertilizer trade. The Strait of Hormuz alone processes roughly 30% of all globally traded agricultural fertilizers.
Bank of America released an analysis warning that 65 to 70% of global urea supplies are currently threatened by this bottleneck.
Yeah.
And benchmark prices have already spiked by 30 to 40%.
It's happening fast.
The economic mechanism here operates exactly like a tsunami. The initial energy price spike is the underwater earthquake. It happens miles out at sea.
Right.
But the devastating second wave that actually crashes into the shore and destroys the coastal towns months later, that is the resulting food shortage.
That second wave inflation model is precisely what agricultural economists are terrified of right now. The timeline is grimly predictable.
Walk us through it.
First, the energy shock makes shipping and manufacturing incredibly expensive. Next, because the raw materials are too costly, fertilizer production drops. Then, farmers in developing nations look at the inflated prices and realize they simply cannot afford to fertilize their fields.
So they plant less or yields drop.
Exactly. Consequently, the upcoming planting season is severely compromised, crop yields plummet, and 6 months later, global food prices explode.
But we survive the unprecedented supply chain disruptions of the global pandemic and the massive grain shocks at the beginning of the Ukraine war. Aren't international markets and global supply chains structurally more resilient now? Or have our strategic buffers been completely wiped out?
The buffers in the developing world are dangerously thin. Wealthy, developed nations can generally absorb these spikes because food and fuel constitute a relatively small percentage of their overall inflation basket.
But not for emerging markets.
No, in emerging markets, those two necessities make up 30 to 50% of the basket. Nations without the capital to maintain massive domestic strategic stockpiles of fertilizer, such as Somalia, Bangladesh, and Kenya, are entirely exposed.
They just don't have a safety net.
They are fundamentally dependent on the continuous, uninterrupted flow of those Gulf supply chains just to feed their populations.
Let's bring this macro-level discussion of inflation, welfare, and structural bottlenecks back home. In our Spotlight section, we are diving into how these exact bread-and-butter economic realities dictate state-level political theater.
Right, looking at the upcoming assembly elections in Tamil Nadu.
Exactly.
Yep.
Now, we're going to impartially look at the strategies here without endorsing any side.
The political landscape in Tamil Nadu is undergoing rapid recalibration right now. We need to look at the mechanics of these alliances objectively. Currently, the state is polarized between the incumbent front, the DMK-led Secular Progressive Alliance, and the main opposition front, the AIA-DMK-led National Democratic Alliance.
And both are having some internal struggles.
Both of these massive legacy coalitions are struggling with deep internal friction regarding how they allocate their power.
The pre-election seat-sharing negotiations look like an incredibly high-stakes game of musical chairs, where the music is about to stop and several longtime political allies might be left without a seat.
That's exactly what it looks like.
Reports suggest the incumbent DMK is demanding a larger share of constituencies, effectively cutting the seat allocations for its smaller regional allies, with the exception of the Congress Party, to make room for new political entrants.
That aggressive consolidation is certainly creating visible fault lines within the incumbent alliance. Simultaneously, the opposition AIADMK is navigating its own fractured base.
What are they dealing with?
Well, they are dealing with the re-entry of splinter factions like the AMMK, while the current leadership under Adapati K. Palaniswamy is taking a very hardline stance against reaccommodating O. Paneerselvam, a former leader who previously defected to the DMK camp.
So a lot of house cleaning.
Yet both major Dravidian parties are expending massive amounts of energy just trying to keep their own houses in order.
But there are massive, unpredictable disruptors entering the arena too. You have a massively popular movie star, actor Vijay, launching his new party, the TVK.
Right. Highly publicized.
Yeah, and he's aggressively organizing grassroots campaigns to capture the anti-incumbency vote. On a different flank, you have Siemens' NTK party, executing a highly unusual strategy for Dravidian politics by deliberately fielding 6 Brahmin candidates.
It's definitely shaking things up.
We consistently hear about celebrity disruptors trying to crash the party in Tamil Nadu. Do figures like Vijay actually possess the structural machinery to threaten the Dravidian duopoly, or they ultimately just fracture the opposition vote and accidentally help the incumbents?
Analyzing historical data, Third Front disruptors have consistently struggled to dismantle the entrenched DMK-AI-ADMK dominance.
Because they lack the ground game.
Exactly. The legacy parties simply have decades of deep, village-level organizational machinery. However, political observers note that Vijay's TVK is systematically targeting the specific demographic and geographic weak spots of the opposition AIADMK.
Okay.
The critical variable is conversion. Can the TVK translate massive fan base enthusiasm and massive rally attendance into a disciplined, booth-level voting operation?
And if they can't?
If they cannot match the legacy party's ground game, the mathematical reality of a first-past-the-post system means they will likely act as a spoiler, heavily fracturing the anti-incumbent vote share.
Moving from the political theater of Tamil Nadu, which has always been deeply rooted in fierce linguistic pride, we turn to our final spotlight piece.
Right, over to Assam.
This takes us to another region where the intersection of historical language rights and modern religious demographics has created a complex generational tug-of-war, Assam's Barak Valley.
And again, we're looking at this impartially to understand the shifting dynamics. The political identity of the Barak Valley is forged in a deeply emotional and violent history.
It goes back to 1961, right?
It does. To understand the current tension, you have to look back to May 19th, 1961. On that day, state police opened fire on a peaceful protest against the imposition of Assamese as the sole official language over the region's native Bengali.
And people died.
Yes. 11 people were killed, including a 16-year-old girl named Kamala Bhattacharya. There's an ongoing, highly charged movement to officially rename the Silchar railway station, the site of the massacre, in their honor.
The memorial at that railway station serves as a literal and figurative intersection where the tracks of historical linguistic heritage violently collide with modern political redistricting.
That collision is exactly what is reshaping the valley today. Historically, the Bengali Hindus and Bengali Muslims in the Barak Valley maintained a strong political solidarity based entirely on their shared linguistic identity, united by the trauma of 1961.
But that is changing now.
Yes, political observers note that over the last decade, that linguistic unity has slowly fractured, replaced by an increasingly polarized narrative centered on religious identity. And this shift was massively accelerated by the Election Commission's 2023 delimitation exercise.
Let's look at the mechanics of that delimitation exercise impartially. The redrawing of the electoral map physically reduced the Barak Valley's representation in the state assembly from 15 seats down to 13.
And importantly, it specifically merged several constituencies that had large Muslim majorities.
The regional opposition parties argue that this was a deliberate act of systemic marginalization, designed to drastically reduce the valley's access to state funding and actively dilute the legislative power of minority demographics.
Conversely, the ruling BJP defends the restructuring by relying on the demographic data of the entire state. They argue that the redrawn boundaries reflect equitable population distribution.
So they say it's just math.
Yes, and furthermore, their local leadership advances a pragmatic political argument. They assert that prioritizing the quality over the quantity of representation is better for the region.
How does that work?
They argue that sending 13 highly unified, politically aligned representatives to the state capital in Dispur will secure far more developmental funding and infrastructure for the Barak Valley than sending 15 fragmented, opposition-aligned voices ever could.
But wait, evaluating that from a pure governance standpoint, is there any actual merit to the idea that having a smaller but fully aligned voting bloc gets more done for a marginalized region than having a larger number of fragmented opposition voices?
Well, from a strictly transactional administrative viewpoint, a unified voting bloc that sits on the side of the ruling government naturally possesses far more leverage to extract infrastructure projects and resource allocations.
Because they hold the keys to the treasury.
They hold the keys to the treasury. However, the foundational premise of a representative democracy is not merely transactional resource extraction, it is proportionate demographic voice.
Right.
When a distinct cultural or linguistic region mathematically loses seats in a state assembly, it permanently loses its structural ability to block unfavorable legislation. It forces a difficult democratic question. Does effective representation mean getting more roads built? Or does it mean having the sheer legislative numbers to protect your community's foundational identity?
That is the core debate right there.
Think about the borders in your own life. We assume geography and language define our communities, but when political maps are redrawn, it forces us to ask, do we choose our identities, or are they drawn for us by those in power?
Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.